Arthur's weathered hands tremble as he holds the photograph. The glass frame cracked from where it fell when he discovered Elaine's handwritten note beside it. Evening sunlight filters through lace curtains, casting long shadows across his solitary figure in the armchair where they once sat together. The scent of her forgotten lavender perfume still clings to the cushion, now mingling with the salt of tears he can no longer contain. His finger traces their smiling faces at the community garden opening, just 3 months ago, though it might as well be another lifetime. 2 years meant nothing, he whispers, voice breaking on the final word as the first sob escapes. His shoulders curve inward, decades of dignified posture crumbling under betrayal's weight. The grandfather clock ticks relentlessly, marking the painful passage of this moment that divides his carefully rebuilt retirement life into before and after. Arthur Bennett straightened the linen napkin for the 3rd time, angling it precisely at 45 degrees on the china plate, the good set, reserved for special occasions. 2 years together merited the effort. He adjusted the silver candlestick a 1/4 inch to the left, then back again, his weathered hands steady from decades of writing on chalkboards. The rosemary chicken, Elaine's favorite, filled his small dining room with a fragrance that mingled with the wine he'd opened to breathe 30 minutes earlier. The grandfather clock, his father's before him, chimed 7:30. Elaine was 20 minutes late, not unusual lately. He caught his reflection in the hallway mirror, straightening his tie. The blue one she'd once said brought out his eyes. At 68, new wrinkles had etched themselves around those eyes, mapping a life of classroom smiles and squints at student papers. Arthur squared his shoulders, a teacher's posture ingrained through 40 years of maintaining dignity before restless teenagers. The gentle knock came as he adjusted the flame beneath the sauce. 3 taps, not the usual 4, a small detail his English teacher's mind catalogued without conscious effort. When he opened the door, Elaine stood scrolling through her phone, looking up with a distracted smile that didn't reach her eyes. Her perfunctory kiss landed on his cheek without warmth. "Sorry I'm late," she said, though her tone lacked genuine apology. The fundraiser planning meeting ran long. Winston had so many wonderful ideas. Winston. 3rd mention this week. Arthur guided her to the table, pulled out her chair with the courtly gesture his father had taught him. "The wine should be perfect now," he said, pouring her glass first. A memory surfaced. Their first dinner here, her genuine laughter at his literary jokes, her body leaning forward with real interest. The contrast tightened his throat. Halfway through serving the chicken, Elaine's hand reached across the table, her practiced touch gentle but somehow clinical. "Arthur," she began, voice softening to a tone he suddenly recognized as rehearsed. "I've been thinking about us. You're such an important part of my life, but I think we should just be friends." Arthur's fork paused midway to his mouth. His heartbeat seemed suddenly audible in the silence, though his expression remained composed, the same control that had once quieted rowdy classrooms without raising his voice. "I value what we have too much to lose you completely," she continued, eyes not quite meeting his. "But I've been meeting some fascinating people at the charity events. I need space to explore those connections." Space. Such a small word for such an enormous request. A single drop of wine fell from Arthur's glass as he set it down, spreading like a tiny crimson stain across the white tablecloth. Like the truth seeping into his consciousness. "I understand," he said, the words emerging with a steadiness that surprised him. His hands methodically folded his napkin, each crease precise, a small ritual of order while his world tilted. Her phone chimed. Her eyes flickered to it with barely concealed eagerness. When she left, earlier than their dinners usually ended, Arthur stood at the window watching her walk to her car. As she pulled away, her phone screen illuminated her face in the darkness. The message notification caught his eye. Winston. Looking forward to tomorrow night. Arthur's reflection stared back at him from the darkened glass, a man suddenly aware he had been the last to know. 8 days, 14 hours since dinner. Not that Arthur was counting. The soft lamplight pooled around his armchair, leaving the corners of his living room in shadow. He'd been staring at the same page of Hemingway's A Clean, Well-Lighted Place for 20 minutes, the words blurring as his mind returned to Elaine's just friends declaration. The grandfather clock ticked steadily in the background, marking time in a world that suddenly felt less certain. His half-empty tea had grown cold beside the book she'd given him for his birthday, bookmark frozen halfway through since that night. The scent of Earl Grey mingled with the faint trace of furniture polish from his earlier cleaning, an activity he'd taken up with unusual vigor lately. Keeping his hands busy kept his mind from wandering too far down painful paths. At 11:37 p.m., his phone rang. Elaine's distinctive tone. He'd never gotten around to changing it. Arthur stared at the illuminated screen, remembering their late-night conversations that often stretched past midnight. His finger hovered above the answer button for 3 full rings before he finally pressed it. "Hello," he said, voice neutral despite the late hour. "Arthur." Her voice came through slightly slurred, the subtle inflection he recognized from their shared bottles of Cabernet. "Are you up? I needed someone to talk to." He remained silent, waiting. "Winston and I had dinner at Bellini's tonight," she continued, words tumbling out. "He made this comment about how he usually dates younger women, then canceled our weekend plans with some vague excuse about a business meeting." Arthur's fingers tightened imperceptibly on the armrest, knuckles whitening before he consciously relaxed them. "I just don't understand men sometimes," she sighed. "I thought we had a connection." He listened for precisely 3 minutes, teacher's patience allowing her monologue to run its course. When she finally paused for breath, he spoke. "I'm sorry you're upset, Elaine," he said, the slight pitch change in his voice imperceptible to anyone who hadn't sat through his literature lectures. "But I think late-night emotional support calls aren't appropriate for our new friendship status." The silence stretched for 10 seconds that seemed much longer. "Are you punishing me?" Her voice shifted from vulnerable to brittle. "For being honest about my feelings?" Arthur removed his reading glasses with his free hand, pinching the bridge of his nose, a gesture familiar from decades of grading papers after midnight. "Establishing healthy boundaries isn't punishment, Elaine. It's respect for both our emotional well-being. If you'd like to talk, perhaps during daytime hours would be better." "I thought we could still talk like before," she said, emphasis on the last word carrying unspoken expectations. "Friends have different boundaries than romantic partners," he replied, the lesson delivered with the same quiet certainty he'd once used to explain the difference between metaphor and simile. "I hope you understand." After ending the call, Arthur sat motionless in his chair, the silence of his apartment suddenly oppressive. His reflection stared back at him from the darkened window, a momentary flash of vulnerability crossing his face now that no one could see. His phone chimed with a text. "I need to see you. This isn't fair." Arthur placed the phone face down on the side table, screen dark. The community newsletter caught his eye, tomorrow's book club meeting circled in red. He would need to speak with Clara about the seating arrangements, another social navigation to consider in their shared retirement community. He closed Hemingway, marking his place though he'd absorbed nothing. The old writer's words about dignity under pressure seemed suddenly, painfully relevant. Arthur had taught that story to high school seniors for decades. Now he found himself living within its themes. The night stretched before him, empty hours until dawn. At 68, he'd learned that some wounds heal slower with age, when each connection carries the weight of time's narrowing possibilities. Arthur timed his arrival at the community center precisely 2 minutes before the book club's official start. Years of teaching had taught him the strategic value of minimizing pre-meeting small talk when necessary. As he pushed open the glass door, the immediate hush in conversation confirmed his suspicions. He had become the subject of discussion. Afternoon sunlight streamed through the freshly cleaned windows, illuminating dust motes dancing above the bookshelves. The familiar scent of old pages mingled with coffee from porcelain cups, balanced precariously on wooden side tables bearing water rings from countless previous gatherings. The chairs had been arranged in their usual circle, but Arthur noticed immediately the conspicuous gap around his regular seat. Physical space, manifesting social distance. Clara Winters, 72 and arthritis bent but sharp as ever, deliberately took the chair beside him while others busied themselves with notebooks and coffee cups. Her veined hand briefly touched his arm in subtle support that required no words between friends of 40 years standing. "Good to see you, Arthur," she said, voice carrying just loudly enough for nearby ears. "What did you think of the ending?" Bit ambiguous for my taste. He gratefully followed her lead into literary discussion, aware of Helen Baker watching them while twisting her pearl necklace between nervous fingers. The pearls, always real, never costume, clicked softly against her manicured nails, a sound Arthur had come to associate with community gossip in progress. During the refreshment break, Clara maneuvered them toward the coffee urn, creating a momentary bubble of semi-privacy. "Thought you should know," she murmured, stirring her coffee longer than necessary. "Elaine's been quite descriptive about your difficulty accepting your new friendship status." Arthur nodded once, neither surprised nor requiring elaboration. "She's also been mentioning her new friend Winston Blackwell at every opportunity," Clara continued, her former journalist's economy with words remaining intact. "Wealthy philanthropist, apparently quite taken with her." "I see," Arthur said, the two simple words carrying the weight of understanding. When discussion turned to the novel's theme of perception versus reality, Arthur found himself speaking with unexpected animation about unreliable narrators. "The fascinating aspect is how convincingly they present their version of events," he explained, decades of literary analysis flowing naturally. "The reader must look for inconsistencies, moments where the narrative doesn't quite align with observable facts." Several members looked up with surprise, clearly having expected emotional withdrawal rather than academic insight. Helen Baker's pearls stilled momentarily in her fingers. As the meeting concluded, Director Phillips approached with unusual warmth in her typically professional demeanor. "Arthur, a moment?" she asked, waiting until others had moved toward the exit. "We're launching a literature program for residents, classics discussion, poetry workshops, that sort of thing. If you might be interested in leading it, I'd appreciate your thoughts. Your background would be perfect." The timing seemed either coincidental or strategic. Arthur couldn't yet determine which. "I'd be happy to consider it," he replied, genuine interest briefly lighting his eyes before his expression returned to careful neutrality. Walking home along the community's winding path, Arthur overheard two residents on a bench discussing the fundraiser planning committee. "Quite the argument between Elaine and that Blackwell fellow," one was saying. "He seemed barely to remember her name, yet she's been telling everyone they're practically dating." "Hush, Margaret," the other warned, noticing Arthur's approach. He nodded politely as he passed, maintaining his unhurried pace while internally cataloging this new information. Near the community bulletin board, a freshly posted newsletter caught his eye. The headline announced Winston Blackwell as major donor for the upcoming building renovation, his photograph showing a distinguished man considerably closer to Arthur's age than Elaine had implied during their late-night conversation. Arthur paused, teacher's mind automatically connecting disparate facts into a coherent narrative. Elaine's sudden desire for friendship, her complaints about Winston's age comments, and now this photograph suggesting those comments couldn't have been what she'd described. The pieces were arranging themselves into a picture he wasn't sure he wanted to see clearly. 3 days after the book club meeting, Arthur entered the community center library section to return his worn copy of Renaissance poetry. The building was unusually quiet for a Tuesday afternoon, a stroke of timing that would prove consequential. As he approached the biography shelves, Elaine's distinctive laugh floated from the adjacent reading room, stopping him mid-step. "I know, I'm trying to be patient with him," she was saying, her voice carrying clearly through the thin wall. Arthur remained perfectly still, the book half-shelved between Marlowe and Milton.
"He's been so clingy since I let him down gently," Elaine continued, the phone conversation evidently with Winston. "I explained we should just be friends, but he keeps expecting more. It's exhausting managing someone else's emotions all the time." Arthur stood frozen, dust motes dancing in the striped sunlight filtering through half-drawn blinds. The worn carpet beneath his feet muffled any sound of his presence, while the poor construction of the dividing wall amplified every word with uncomfortable clarity. "Tonight? I thought we had plans." Elaine's tone shifted abruptly, the confidence faltering. "Oh, I see. Yes, a business dinner does sound important." A beat of silence followed, her voice becoming softer, almost pleading. "Perhaps tomorrow, then?" Another pause, longer this time. "Of course, I understand you're busy. Call when you can." Arthur heard the distinctive sound of a call ending, followed by a sigh. He was about to quietly retreat when the reading room door opened. "Oh, Helen." Elaine's voice immediately brightened. "Just the person I needed to see." "Are you all right, dear?" Helen Baker's concerned tone carried the pearl clicking sound that accompanied her gossip gathering. "It's just been difficult," Elaine replied, voice masterfully modulated to convey dignified suffering. "Arthur's been so challenging about our friendship. I'm trying to be generous, but he seems unable to accept that people grow apart." Arthur's hand tightened imperceptibly on the book spine, knuckles whitening as decades of classroom discipline kept him motionless. "Men can be so emotionally needy," Helen commiserated. "The irony is," Elaine continued, lowering her voice conspiratorially, "whenever Winston is busy, it's actually quite convenient having Arthur's shoulder to cry on. Last week I called him late, pretended to be upset about something Winston said, and Arthur was so eager to comfort me. Until he suddenly got all formal about boundaries." Her tone mimicked the word with subtle mockery. "You don't think he suspects anything?" Helen asked. "Arthur? No. He sees what he wants to see. That's what makes him so—" Elaine paused, searching for the word. "Useful." A single bead of sweat formed at Arthur's temple despite the room's cool temperature, the only outward sign of his internal devastation as the full scope of Elaine's manipulation became clear. With deliberate care, he completed shelving the poetry book, aligning it perfectly with the others, his fingers lingering momentarily on the spine as if drawing strength from literature that had sustained him through previous difficulties. He left as silently as he had arrived, nodding politely to residents he passed on his walk home, his teacher's discipline creating a flawless mask while his mind rapidly reorganized his understanding of recent events. He stopped occasionally to examine a garden flower, giving himself moments to process while appearing perfectly normal to any observer. Each measured step home gave him time to revisit every interaction since their breakup, her late-night call, her text messages, her community narrative. The pattern emerged with painful clarity. He had been cast simultaneously as villain and safety net, a role designed purely for Elaine's convenience. Inside his apartment, Arthur stood before the small shelf where his teaching awards gathered dust. Framed certificates of excellence, a golden apple paperweight from his last class of seniors, photographs with colleagues at his retirement party. 40 years of building wisdom and judgment, yet he had been so thoroughly deceived. His hands, which had guided thousands of students through Shakespeare and Steinbeck with confidence, trembled slightly as he removed his reading glasses, the momentary vulnerability of uncovered eyes in solitude, allowing a flash of hurt to surface briefly before being mastered. Arthur moved to his desk, where the community newsletter lay open to the announcement about the literature program. Director Phillips' email had arrived that morning, formally inviting him to lead the initiative based on strong recommendations from several community members. He sat down and began making notes, his handwriting the same precise script that had filled thousands of student margins with guidance. If Elaine had cast him in a role without his consent, perhaps it was time to write his own character. One defined by neither bitterness nor naivete, but by the dignity he had spent a lifetime cultivating. Arthur arrived at the Literature Program Committee meeting precisely 15 minutes early, portfolio of teaching materials and detailed proposal under his arm. 40 years of faculty meetings had taught him the value of preparation and punctuality. He straightened his tie, navy blue with subtle diagonal stripes, his professional confidence tie from decades of parent-teacher conferences, before entering the room. Conversation halted immediately. 5 pairs of eyes turned to him, then quickly away, exchanging glances that spoke volumes about previous discussions he hadn't been privy to. The community center meeting room felt unnecessarily formal, with its long oak table bearing water rings from years of committee deliberations. Fluorescent lights cast institutional shadows across concerned faces. The coffee maker in the corner gurgled noisily, its sound amplifying the awkward silence. Outside, rain had begun falling, obscuring the garden view, droplets tracking down glass like tears Arthur refused to shed publicly. Director Phillips rose with professional warmth that didn't quite mask her awareness of the tension. "Thank you for coming, Arthur. Let me introduce everyone." She gestured around the table. Helen Baker from the Resident Council, Dr. James Wilson, retired from the university, Meredith Collins, who organizes our book donations, and Marcus Jennings, our new activities coordinator. Arthur noted Marcus particularly, perhaps 28, with rolled shirt sleeves revealing literary quotations tattooed along his forearms. His notebook already contained several pages of notes despite the meeting not yet starting, his pen poised with a journalist's readiness. "Please, share your proposal," Director Phillips invited, settling back into her chair. Arthur placed his portfolio precisely centered before him, the meticulous arrangement revealing both his preparation and his need for order amid emotional chaos. He outlined his vision with measured confidence, a 12-week literature discussion series drawing on diverse authors from Shakespeare to Morrison, with sensitivity to varied reading abilities and interests. The first session would explore Hemingway's A Clean, Well-Lighted Place, he explained, which offers accessible entry points while raising profound questions about dignity and purpose in later life. Helen Baker's pearls clicked against her manicured nails as she interrupted mid-sentence. "Mr. Bennett, while your qualifications are impressive, there are concerns about your current community standing." The room temperature seemed to drop several degrees. "We wonder if personal issues might affect your reliability," she continued, eyes briefly darting toward Director Phillips. "We've heard you're going through a difficult transition." Arthur acknowledged the concern directly, decades of classroom management evident in his response. "I understand your question, Mrs. Baker. Throughout my 40-year teaching career, personal matters remained separate from professional commitments. My students deserved that distinction, as would the participants in this program." He maintained eye contact, neither defensive nor confrontational, his posture reflecting the quiet authority that had once commanded classrooms of restless teenagers. Marcus studied Arthur with unexpected intensity during this exchange, his rapid note-taking initially seeming critical until a barely perceptible nod suggested assessment rather than judgment. Dr. Wilson cleared his throat. "I've reviewed your curriculum proposal, Arthur. It's impressively structured. However," he glanced toward Helen, "perhaps a provisional approval would be appropriate." "With some oversight?" The suggestion hung in the air, a compromise between rejection and trust. Director Phillips nodded. What if Marcus assists for the first few sessions? He has a literature background himself, and it would help integrate the program with our other activities. Arthur recognized the arrangement for what it was, monitoring thinly disguised as assistants. The committee didn't trust him, based entirely on narratives he hadn't been allowed to address. At 68, after decades of professional respect, he was being treated as unreliable because of gossip. "That seems reasonable," he replied, the slight stiffness in his voice detectable only to someone familiar with his usual tone. When the provisional approval was announced, Arthur accepted with a single dignified nod, neither arguing nor displaying disappointment, though his hands refolded his presentation materials with slightly more precision than necessary, a teacher's method of channeling emotion into order. As the meeting ended, Marcus approached while others gathered their materials. "That Hemingway piece, do you focus on the older waiter's perspective, his awareness of nada versus the younger waiter's impatience?" The question revealed unexpected literary knowledge, creating momentary uncertainty about Marcus's actual role and motivations within this developing situation. "Yes, exactly," Arthur replied, genuine interest briefly lighting his eyes. "The older waiter's understanding of the importance of dignity and light." Marcus nodded, something shifting in his assessment. "I've got some thoughts on that. Maybe we could discuss before the first session." Later, Arthur returned to his apartment as evening shadows lengthened across his living room. He made tea out of habit, then sat staring at the steaming cup until it grew cold, untouched. The empty chair across from him, where Elaine used to sit during their literary discussions, seemed to mock his solitude. Decades of building respect and reputation, now undermined by whispers he couldn't address without seeming defensive. The provisional approval felt like a statement about his character rather than his qualifications, a public vote of limited confidence after a lifetime of competence. In the silence of his apartment, no student essays to grade, no lesson plans to prepare, the weight of isolation pressed down with particular cruelty. For the first time since Elaine's revelation, Arthur allowed himself a moment of unguarded emotion, the carefully maintained facade cracking briefly in the privacy of his home. Has betrayal ever left you feeling invisible despite a lifetime of building respect? Comment your experience like if Arthur's quiet dignity resonates with you, and follow to see if his wisdom will ultimately triumph over manipulation. Arthur arrived an hour early for the first literature session, arranging chairs in a circle rather than rows, a deliberate choice to foster conversation rather than lecture. He placed a crisp handout and sharpened pencil at each seat, positioned at precise angles. Books stacked neatly on the central table, post-it notes marking key passages in Hemingway's A Clean, Well-Lighted Place. He'd brewed fresh coffee, the aroma mixing with lemon cleaner and the faint chalk dust from the rarely used blackboard he'd filled with his careful handwriting. At his core, beneath the hurt and isolation, he was still a teacher. 10 minutes before starting time, Marcus entered, surprised to find the room transformed. "You've been busy," he said, eyeing the detailed notes on the board. "Old habits," Arthur replied, adjusting his tie. "Preparation was always my defense against classroom uncertainty." Marcus nodded, revealing unexpected understanding. "Literature was my undergraduate major before switching to recreation management. Hemingway was actually my thesis focus." Arthur reassessed the young man, noticing the Faulkner quote tattooed along his forearm. "The past is never dead. It's not even past." Perhaps his assistant wasn't merely a monitor after all. Students began arriving, 7 hesitant residents, including Clara, who took a front seat with encouraging determination. Arthur noted Helen Baker slipping in at the last moment, sitting near the door as if planning a quick escape. Her pearl necklace twisted between nervous fingers, the unofficial community pulse taker present to gather impressions. "Welcome," Arthur began, voice finding its natural classroom cadence. "Today, we're exploring a story about 2 waiters and an old man in a cafe, a simple setting for profound questions. Initial responses were tentative, participants watching Marcus more than Arthur, clearly aware of the oversight arrangement. But as discussion deepened, Arthur's passion for literature gradually transformed the atmosphere. His hands became animated as he explored Hemingway's themes, decades of enthusiasm emerging through initially controlled gestures. "What does the older waiter understand that the younger doesn't?" Arthur asked, the question carrying subtle parallel to his own situation. Only Marcus seemed to notice, their eyes briefly meeting in mutual recognition. "Dignity," Clara offered. "The older waiter knows that the cafe isn't just about coffee. It's about having somewhere clean and well-lighted to exist with dignity when the world feels dark." "Exactly," Arthur replied, genuine warmth in his voice. Hemingway understood that dignity isn't just for the young. Perhaps it becomes even more essential as we age. By session's end, the initial wariness had dissolved into engaged discussion. Even Helen's pearls had stilled as she leaned forward, abandoning her observer stance to argue a point about the old man's suicide attempt. As participants lingered afterward, sharing personal connections to the text, Arthur felt something long dormant awakening, the pure satisfaction of guiding minds through literature's landscape. Marcus approached as the room emptied. "That was not what I expected," he admitted. "You have a gift for making people feel both challenged and comfortable simultaneously." "The text does the work," Arthur replied modestly. "I'm merely the guide." "False modesty doesn't suit you, Professor," Marcus said with unexpected directness. "We both know what happened in this room." Before Arthur could respond, Clara returned, her expression uncharacteristically grave. "Arthur, a moment?" she asked, waiting until Marcus stepped away. "There's something you should know. Elaine's relationship with Winston collapsed rather publicly at the fundraiser planning meeting yesterday." "Collapsed?" Arthur kept his voice neutral. He arrived with another companion, Judith something from the symphony board. Barely acknowledged Elaine beyond a casual greeting. She was... Clara searched for the appropriate word. Distraught afterward." Arthur absorbed this information with outward calm, though inwardly he felt the pieces of Elaine's manipulation falling more completely into place. "Thank you for telling me, Clara." "I thought you should be prepared," she added meaningfully. "In case." Arthur understood the warning. Rejection often sought someone to blame. That evening, precisely at 10:42 p.m., the knock came at his door. 3 tentative taps, not the confident rhythm Elaine once used. Arthur had been reading in his armchair, halfway expecting this visit since Clara's warning. He opened the door to find Elaine, eyes reddened, makeup slightly smudged. "Arthur," she said, voice deliberately fragile. "I'm not feeling well. I think I might have a fever. Could I come in?" She swayed slightly, a calculated vulnerability that once would have immediately activated his protective instincts. Now, with clearer vision, he recognized the performance. "I'm sorry you're unwell," he said, remaining firmly in his doorway, neither inviting her in nor sending her away harshly. "The community has excellent health services. I'd be happy to call for you." Confusion flickered across her face, quickly replaced by practiced distress. "I have no one else to turn to," she said, the admission revealing more than she intended about Winston's absence. "As a friend," Arthur emphasized gently, "I'm concerned about your health." "But medical attention would be more appropriate than my amateur care." "You're punishing me," she accused, voice hardening as her strategy failed. "No, Elaine. I'm respecting the boundaries of our friendship, exactly as you requested." The measured response carried no malice, only calm certainty. After she left, rejection transmuted to indignation, Arthur returned to his reading chair, the book open but unread as he considered the evening's interaction. There was no satisfaction in witnessing Elaine's plans unravel, only a quiet reaffirmation that his own path forward lay elsewhere. His thoughts turned to the literature class, to Marcus's unexpected literary knowledge, to the moment when the room had transformed from suspicious monitoring to genuine engagement. For the first time since Elaine had asked to just be friends, Arthur felt something beyond hurt or dignity. A flicker of renewed purpose, fragile but growing. The classroom had always been his true home. Perhaps it could be again. 3 successful weeks of literature discussions had restored a rhythm to Arthur's life. The class had grown to 12 participants, with a waiting list forming for the next session. Even Director Phillips had attended the previous week's discussion of Joyce's Araby, afterward commenting on the remarkable engagement she'd observed. Arthur entered the classroom on Thursday afternoon, lesson plans for Flannery O'Connor's A Good Man is Hard to Find tucked under his arm. He immediately sensed the disruption. Conversations halted abruptly, several participants exchanging uncomfortable glances. Clara was conspicuously absent, while Helen Baker sat straighter than usual, her pearls clicking rapidly between agitated fingers. Setting his materials on the table, Arthur maintained his teacher's composure. "Good afternoon," he said evenly. "Shall we begin with your initial reactions to O'Connor's use of foreshadowing?" The silence stretched uncomfortably until Marcus entered, 15 minutes late, unprecedented in their now established routine. His expression was troubled, eyes meeting Arthur's with reluctant purpose. "Mr. Bennett, could I speak with you privately for a moment?" he asked, gesturing toward the hallway. Arthur followed, noting the relief on participants' faces at the interruption. Whatever had created this tension, Marcus apparently held the explanation. In the empty hallway, Marcus ran a hand through his hair, the professional demeanor he'd developed in their working relationship momentarily abandoned. "I'm sorry to do this, but I thought you should hear it from, well, someone who's not invested in the gossip." Arthur waited, already suspecting what might be coming. "Elaine has been telling people she's pregnant," Marcus said, the words emerging with evident discomfort. "She's implying it's yours, from before your breakup." A single heartbeat of silence followed as Arthur processed this information. Then, with characteristic precision, he asked, "When exactly is she claiming this occurred?" "From what I've heard, she's saying it was right before you broke up, about 7 weeks ago." "I see." The timeline made the claim impossible. Elaine had ended their relationship nearly 11 weeks ago, and there had been no intimacy for several weeks before that. The mathematical impossibility would be evident to anyone who knew the actual dates. Arthur gazed out the classroom window toward the garden where he and Elaine had once walked regularly. The accumulated injustice threatened momentarily to overwhelm his composure. First, the manipulation of their relationship, then the community narrative, now this outright fabrication designed to damage him when her other plans had failed. "Will you cancel class today?" Marcus asked. "No," Arthur decided, straightening his shoulders. "Literature continues regardless of personal circumstances. That's one lesson I hope to impart." He returned to the classroom, noting how participants studied his face for reaction to what they clearly all had heard. For a moment, he was reminded of his high school classroom after particularly salacious rumors had circulated. The same barely disguised curiosity, the same expectation of dramatic response. "O'Connor believed that moments of grace often come through violence and disruption," he began, voice steady. "Today we'll explore how her characters face moral challenges that reveal their true nature." By focusing entirely on the text, Arthur gradually reclaimed the room's atmosphere. Marcus contributed thoughtfully, their literary dialogue creating normalcy that allowed participants to engage despite the unspoken tension. When class ended, several members lingered briefly, their awkward expressions suggesting support they couldn't quite articulate. Afterward, Director Phillips summoned Arthur to her office, her expression grave, but eyes assessing his reaction carefully. "I assume you've heard what Elaine is claiming," she said once the door closed behind them. "Yes," Arthur replied simply. "And?" Her tone suggested she was testing rather than accusing. "The timeline makes it impossible," he stated, neither defensive nor angry. "Elaine ended our relationship 11 weeks ago, and we had no intimate contact for some time before that. Simple mathematics disproves her claim." Director Phillips removed her glasses, a gesture Arthur had come to recognize as her shift from administrator to human advocate. "I suspected as much. This isn't the first time we've had complicated situations in our community. Experience teaches one to consider all perspectives." She studied him for a moment longer. "Your literature program has been remarkably successful, Arthur. The waiting list suggests we should consider expanding it next session." The deliberate change of subject communicated more than words. She believed him and was offering professional affirmation at the moment personal attack threatened to undermine him. "Thank you," he replied, understanding the message beneath the practical suggestion. Walking home across the community grounds, Arthur felt strangely calm despite the new assault on his reputation. The claim was so clearly false that it carried the seeds of its own destruction. Anyone who bothered to check dates would see the impossibility. But how many would bother? How many would find gossip more satisfying than mathematical verification? He paused by a bench overlooking the garden, considering his options. He could publicly refute Elaine's claim, providing dates and details that would expose her lie. He could consult the community's mediation services, filing a formal complaint about defamation. He could even seek legal counsel, though the thought of dragging such personal matters into public record repelled him. Or he could maintain his dignity and allow truth to emerge on its own timeline, a teacher's patience applied to life rather than literature. The moral dilemma weighed heavily as he considered which approach would best preserve not just his reputation, but his sense of self. What defined him more truly? Aggressive self-defense or dignified restraint? What would ultimately reveal more about his character to a community still forming judgments? When dignity and truth collide, what would you choose? Has patience ever been your strongest defense? Comment your thoughts, like if Arthur's restraint shows wisdom rather than weakness, and follow to witness the power of quiet integrity against manipulation. As Arthur contemplated his response, Clara approached from the community center, her expression suggesting news she felt compelled to share despite her natural discretion. "Arthur," she began without preamble, "you should know that Winston Blackwell is attending the fundraiser this Saturday, with his new companion from the Symphony Board." The information hung between them, its significance clear without elaboration. Winston's appearance would create a timeline problem for Elaine's narrative, both her relationship claims and, potentially, her pregnancy fabrication. "Thank you, Clara," Arthur said simply. She nodded once, understanding that some matters required no discussion between old friends who recognized the value of dignity in difficult moments. Arthur turned toward home, each step measured and deliberate. The truth would emerge, with or without his intervention. The question was whether he could maintain his principles while waiting for that natural revelation, whether the teacher's patience that had served him for 40 years would prove sufficient against this most personal attack. Arthur straightened his bow tie in the mirror, a concession to the formal nature of the community fundraiser. The annual event typically drew sizable donations for building improvements and scholarship funds for low-income seniors. Under normal circumstances, he might have skipped it this year, given recent events. But his deliberate presence tonight was a statement of innocence rather than avoidance. The community center's main hall had been transformed for the occasion. Spring flower arrangements adorned white-clothed tables. Soft lighting created a deceptively festive atmosphere. A string quartet played in the corner, their classical selections creating an elegant backdrop to the murmur of conversation. Arthur accepted a glass of punch from a volunteer, nodding thanks. He had arrived precisely on time, neither conspicuously early nor fashionably late, a calculated neutrality. From across the room, he spotted Elaine holding court near the donation table, several residents gathered around her in supportive proximity. She wore a loose-fitting dress that suggested without confirming her claimed condition, one hand occasionally resting meaningfully on her stomach during conversation. Clara materialized at his side, resplendent in a vintage blue dress she reserved for special occasions. "Quite the performance," she murmured, nodding toward Elaine. "Indeed," Arthur replied quietly. "Director Phillips asked me to join the welcome committee for Winston Blackwell," Clara continued. "He's expected around 8, with his companion from the symphony board." The information hung between them. In 30 minutes, the carefully constructed narrative Elaine had built would face its most significant challenge. Arthur circulated with deliberate casualness, exchanging pleasantries with residents who seemed uncertain how to address him given the rumors. He noticed Helen Baker watching him from beside a floral arrangement, her pearl necklace twisted anxiously between fingers that paused whenever Elaine's laugh rose above the general conversation. Marcus arrived wearing a surprisingly well-tailored suit that transformed his usual casual appearance. The literary quotation tattooed on his wrist peeked from beneath his cuff as he extended a hand to Arthur. "Interesting evening ahead," he said, the understatement carrying shared understanding. "Literature prepares us for such moments," Arthur replied. Reality revealing itself despite careful fiction. At precisely 8 o'clock, a stir near the entrance signaled new arrivals. Winston Blackwell entered with a distinguished-looking woman on his arm, Judith Harrington, according to the whispers that immediately circulated. Winston's confident stride and the woman's comfortable familiarity with him suggested a relationship considerably more established than recent acquaintance. Director Phillips guided them through initial greetings before they began circulating among donors. Arthur positioned himself near a refreshment table, neither seeking nor avoiding the inevitable intersection of narratives about to unfold. He didn't have to wait long. Winston and Judith approached the donation table where Elaine still held court, now with an expression of growing alarm as she tracked their progress through the room. "Elaine, nice to see you again," Winston said with casual politeness when they reached her group. His tone carried no recognition of romantic connection, merely the cordial acknowledgement one might offer a distant acquaintance. "Your fundraising committee has done an exceptional job with the event." Elaine's carefully constructed composure faltered visibly. "Winston," she managed, her voice tight. "I've been trying to reach you this week." "Have you?" He seemed genuinely surprised. "My apologies. Board meetings have consumed my schedule lately. Have you met Judith? She chairs the symphony's outreach program." The woman beside him extended her hand with professional warmth, clearly unaware of any potential complication. "Elaine, I've heard wonderful things about your contribution to the community." The exchange created a ripple effect among observers. Residents who had heard Elaine's version of their relationship now witnessing an interaction that contradicted her narrative. Helen Baker's pearls clicked against each other with increased agitation as she glanced between Winston and Elaine. "Actually," Elaine said, her voice rising slightly with desperation, "I needed to discuss something rather important with you, Winston. Something personal." Winston's polite confusion made clear their relationship existed primarily in Elaine's representation. "Perhaps you could call my office next week. My assistant can find a time." "It can't wait," Elaine interrupted, her hand moving to rest on her stomach with deliberate emphasis. "It's about our future." A confused silence fell across the immediate vicinity as Winston's expression shifted from polite engagement to complete bewilderment. "Our future? I'm afraid I don't understand." Judith glanced between them, professional smile maintaining but eyes sharpening with new assessment. "The baby," Elaine said, voice dropping to a stage whisper perfectly calibrated to carry to nearby listeners. "Our baby." Winston's genuine shock might have been comical in another context. "Baby? Elaine, we've had lunch exactly twice, both times with the fundraising committee present." The mathematical impossibility of Elaine's narrative began unraveling publicly without Arthur needing to speak a single accusatory word. The timeline discrepancies became apparent to everyone within earshot. If Winston had barely interacted with Elaine, her pregnancy claim about Arthur from a relationship that ended 11 weeks ago created an irreconcilable contradiction. As murmurs spread through the gathering, Elaine's increasingly frantic explanations only created further exposure as dates contradicted and details became confused. Community members' expressions shifted from sympathy to skepticism, without Arthur having to defend himself. When Elaine turned to him in desperate appeal, "Arthur, tell them about us," he responded with simple truth, his voice carrying no malice despite ample justification. "There is no us, Elaine. You ended our relationship to pursue other interests. I've respected your decision." The straightforward statement, delivered without accusation, proved more devastating than any attack could have been. The contrast between Arthur's dignified restraint and Elaine's manufactured drama spoke volumes about their respective characters. As Elaine's public unraveling continued, Arthur felt no triumph, only a quiet sadness at witnessing the consequences of manipulation. When she became visibly distraught, he even offered her water, genuine compassion transcending justified resentment. The gesture was noticed by observers, further shifting community perception. Later, as Arthur prepared to leave the uncomfortable scene, he was approached by a woman he recognized but had never formally met, Marissa Chen, the pottery instructor whose studio occupied a converted storage building at the community's edge. Her observant eyes had missed nothing of the evening's drama. "Sometimes the truth doesn't need our help to emerge," she said, her direct manner refreshing after months of whispers and insinuations. "It just needs us to stand still and let it find its way forward." Arthur studied her, approximately his age, with clay-stained fingertips despite her evening attire, suggesting dedication to her craft that transcended occasion. "You sound like you're speaking from experience." "Let's just say I recognized the pattern," she replied with a knowing half-smile. "Elaine's techniques aren't particularly original when you've seen them before." Her implication that she too had encountered Elaine's manipulation created an unexpected connection, someone who understood without requiring explanation. As they parted, Marissa mentioned her pottery students were seeking literary themes for an upcoming project, creating a natural reason for future conversation. Arthur walked home beneath spring stars, the weight of public vindication neither as triumphant nor as satisfying as he might once have imagined. The truth had indeed emerged on its own timeline, without requiring his intervention beyond maintaining his own integrity. There was a lesson there, one he would eventually incorporate into his literature discussions. Dignity, it seemed, was its own form of power. 3 months after the fundraiser, Arthur stood before his literature class, now expanded to 3 weekly sessions with a consistent waiting list. The classroom had evolved with the program's success. Student-contributed quotes adorned the walls, bookshelves housed an exchange library of personal favorites, and the once sterile community center space had acquired the comfortable, lived-in feel of a genuine learning environment. "As we conclude our discussion of Steinbeck," Arthur said, watching engaged faces rather than blank expressions, "consider his belief that the pursuit of dignity might be humanity's most essential quest. Next week, we'll explore how Baldwin approaches similar themes from a different perspective." After class, Marcus lingered to discuss the curriculum for the advanced group that had formed from the original participants. Their working relationship had evolved from assigned oversight to genuine collaboration, with Marcus's literature background complementing Arthur's teaching experience. "The combined session with Marissa's pottery students went better than I expected," Marcus commented. "Having them create physical interpretations of literary themes produced some remarkable insights." Arthur nodded, thinking of the clay sculpture one participant had created to represent the cafe in Hemingway's story, a small, illuminated sanctuary against surrounding darkness. Crossing disciplines often reveals connections we miss in isolation. The collaborative project had been Marissa's suggestion during their increasingly regular conversations. What began as professional consultation had gradually shifted toward personal connection, their shared appreciation for creative expression providing common ground for deeper understanding. As they gathered materials, Director Phillips appeared in the doorway, her expression reflecting the program's vindication of her initial support. "Arthur, the board approved the dedicated budget for literature programming next year. They were particularly impressed with the intergenerational aspect of Marcus's involvement and the cross-disciplinary work with the pottery studio." "That's excellent news," Arthur replied, genuine satisfaction warming his voice. "We have several expansions planned if resources permit." "You've created something valuable here," she said, the simple acknowledgement carrying weight after the previous month's challenges. The waiting list speaks for itself. Later that afternoon, Arthur made his way to Marissa's studio, carrying a folder of literary excerpts she had requested for her students' next project. The converted storage building at the community's edge had become a familiar destination, its large windows flooding the space with natural light, shelves displaying residents' creations in various stages of completion. Marissa looked up from the pottery wheel as he entered, her hands covered in clay, a smudge across her cheek from an absent-minded gesture. "Perfect timing," she said. "I'm just finishing this piece. Would you mind putting the kettle on?" The easy domesticity of the request reflected their comfortable routine. Arthur moved through her studio with familiar confidence, preparing tea while she completed her work. Unlike his earlier relationship with Elaine, their interactions carried no performance or calculation, just straightforward appreciation of each other's company and perspectives. "I heard an interesting piece of news today," Marissa said as she washed clay from her hands. "Elaine has taken a position with a senior community in Arizona. Apparently, she left rather suddenly." Arthur absorbed this information without surprise. After the fundraiser revelation, Elaine had withdrawn from community activities, her fabrications having finally caught up with her. He had neither sought details nor spread gossip, maintaining the dignity that had ultimately served him better than any revenge could have. "I hope she finds what she's looking for," he said simply, meaning it despite everything. Marissa studied him with the perceptive gaze that missed nothing. "That's remarkably generous, considering. Bitterness would only complete what she began," Arthur replied. "I prefer to focus on rebuilding rather than replaying." They carried their tea to the small garden behind the studio, where 2 chairs faced the western sky. The location had become their preferred spot for conversations that ranged from artistic theory to personal philosophy, the setting sun painting the clouds in colors that changed with each visit. "My advanced students want to create pieces based on the concept of resilience," Marissa said, warming her hands around her mug. "I thought your perspective might help them conceptualize it beyond cliches." "Resilience isn't just enduring difficulty," Arthur reflected. "It's finding new growth through the broken places, like the Japanese art of kintsugi, repairing pottery with gold to highlight rather than hide the damage." Marissa smiled. "I've used that example in class. The idea that something can be more beautiful for having been broken." Their hands rested side by side on the bench between them, neither acknowledging nor avoiding the proximity. The comfortable silence between them contrasted sharply with the performative conversations that had characterized his time with Elaine, each pause filled with mutual understanding rather than calculation. "Do you ever regret not confronting her more directly?" Marissa asked, the question emerging from their ongoing exploration of responding to manipulation. "The best response to manipulation is simply to live well," Arthur replied, the wisdom earned rather than theoretical. "My students often want revenge in literature to be dramatic and immediate, but the most powerful consequences usually unfold naturally through character and choice." Marissa nodded, her pottery-stained fingers absently arranging small stones on the bench between them. "I learned that lesson the hard way with my ex-husband. Trying to force justice often just keeps us tethered to the pain." Their shared understanding needed no elaboration. Both had experienced betrayal's sting and chosen dignity's more difficult but ultimately more rewarding path. As twilight settled around them, their conversation turned to future projects. A joint exhibition of literature and pottery for the community's anniversary celebration, expanded intergenerational programs with Marcus's assistance, new reading selections for the advanced group, plans that looked forward rather than backward, creating rather than dwelling. When Arthur finally rose to leave, Marissa walked him to the garden gate. "I meant to ask, would you be interested in joining me for the symphony next weekend? A former student is performing, and she offered tickets." The invitation hung in the air between them, significant but not pressured, an opening rather than an expectation. "I'd enjoy that very much," Arthur replied, his smile reaching his eyes in a way that had become more frequent in recent months. Walking home across the community grounds, Arthur passed the bench where he had once sat alone processing Elaine's betrayal. The location remained the same, but its significance had transformed. No longer a site of isolation, but simply another spot in a community where he had reclaimed his place through patience and integrity. In his apartment, he moved to the bookshelf, where a small clay pot now sat among his teaching awards, Marissa's gift after their first collaborative project. Its subtle blue glaze and slightly asymmetrical form represented a different kind of perfection than his usually ordered preferences, a reminder that beauty often emerged from unexpected directions. At 68, Arthur had discovered that new chapters remained possible at any age. The painful experience with Elaine had ultimately led to deeper connections, renewed purpose, and perhaps most importantly, reinforced the value of maintaining boundaries with dignity. The very quality she had attempted to exploit, his fundamental decency, had become his greatest strength. The best revenge, indeed, had been treating her exactly as she had asked. Just a friend, with all the appropriate boundaries that entailed, not from spite or calculation, but from genuine self-respect. In maintaining his dignity, Arthur had not only preserved himself, but found his way to something better than what had been lost. The teacher had, in the end, learned perhaps the most valuable lesson of all, that wisdom without compassion was hollow, but compassion without boundaries was unsustainable. Finding that balance had been his true victory, one that would serve him well in whatever chapter came next. In the evening of life, betrayal cuts deeper, doesn't it? The years teach us to value authentic connection precisely because time grows more precious. We've weathered enough storms to recognize when clouds gather, yet our hearts, stubborn, hopeful things, sometimes still override wisdom's quiet warning. Perhaps that's not weakness, but the beautiful persistence of trust, despite life's hard lessons. The true measure of dignity isn't found in never falling, but in how we rise again. Boundaries aren't walls built from bitterness. They're the gentle gardener's stake supporting new growth toward light. When someone treats your kindness as currency to be spent rather than connection to be treasured, remember, your worth has never depended on their recognition. The quiet power of no often speaks more eloquently than 1,000 justifications. We who have witnessed decades understand that life's most profound truths emerge not in dramatic declarations, but in consistent choices. Integrity isn't glamorous. It builds no monuments, earns few accolades, yet it remains the foundation upon which all meaningful relationships stand. Like afternoon light through old windows, wisdom casts its gentle illumination most beautifully across rooms we've taken time to furnish with self-knowledge and compassion. Thank you for walking alongside Arthur through this journey of betrayal and renewal. His story may have ended, but yours continues, carrying the same potential for dignity amid disappointment, for connection after loss, for purpose rediscovered when familiar paths close. Have you, like Arthur, found strength in boundaries or renewal after betrayal? Share your story of resilience in the comments below, like if his quiet dignity resonated with your own experience, and follow for more narratives that honor the complex wisdom of our later years.